the first returning guest of Who Knows. How are you today?
I'm good. I should clarify for your audience too. I'm around next. I've got 3 Boston Terriers, all of which you will insist on finding a way to move the camera. So things look casual. It is beyond my control, although I am generally casual.
That fits here too. We don't really edit, so we'll just take it all.
You're at great risk having me on without editing.
How was the year at Cornell? I'm sure it was eventful.
Well, it was for Cornell. A friend of mine is right now interim president, and I feel very bad for him. So he's been through a lot. He had to go through the whole COVID thing. He was provost at the time. We hired a president about 8 years ago. She was okay, but we hired one right before her, and she died within 3 or 4 months of taking it. They do a physical. They look up every orifice and stuff, and there's a part of your intestines that the scope's going down and up can't see. There's a kind of a blind spot in there, and she had a big tumor there.
Oh man!
I think she's going to be good. The current president, who's now resigned, has been okay, but not a very strong president, in my opinion. The provost is fantastic. They should just. I've heard they're going to slow walk the search for the president for a host of reasons, one of which is there's a number of searches. And so you don't want to be competing with a bunch of schools that try to hire the same people.
Oh, yeah.
And second of all, I think they kind of like the provost being interim president, and they're kind of hoping that the shit stops hitting the fan politically, and that they'll be able to actually hire, in my words, the best person for the job instead of having to check some fucking box.
Yeah. Were there? I didn't read about it or anything, but were there the protests on your campus too?
Yeah, we had an interesting problem where the campuses are a hotbed for Palestinian protests, and it's not because they know about what's going on in Israel and Palestine and stuff like that, but rather I think in the victim Olympics, the Palestinians score very high, and so I think it's a natural gravitational pull. And kids are supposed to do that, but when Hamas attacked Israel, and again, I don't talk too much about this topic because it's toxic. There's no win to talking about it, really. But one of my colleagues, a guy named Rickman, said he was exhilarated by the attack, and that got in national press. That got us in a bit of trouble, And as I say to wealthy donors who might be listening in, thinking, "Oh, I'm not gonna give any more money to Cornell or to whatever your alma mater is," I say, if you somehow all this time thought that there were no nutcases on the faculty, that's your big mistake. There's always been nutcases on the faculty. We've been in plain sight, as I like to say, and I saw God Saad seminar on campus. He's a Cornell grad, and he gave a very good talk, and he talked about how sort of woke everything looks and how bad everything looks. And I told him, I said, if you were a World War II vintage grad and you showed up in the mid-'60s, you would have thought the sky was falling. Mm-hmm. So, we go through these periods where the kids on campus, to the older generation, look like a gaggle of assholes, but they're just being young punks.
Yeah. Well, so we're almost halfway through the year. I know you do the year in review each year. Do you sort of, do you kind of retain throughout the year what you'll include in that? I'm curious to know what might be on your mind if we're almost halfway.
Well, so the way I actually do it is I have any computer that I have an open Word file. And if I read something and I'll grab a quote or I'll grab a paragraph or something and paste it in with a link. And then I just kind of it's kind of like a diary for me in some sense. And I let the year just evolve. And then as the year evolves and it starts to pick up a personality, almost like, Mother Nature out there knows that each year's got to have some sort of theme. And and this year it's a little novel because the theme is Israel-Palestine, and I've got a somewhat of a personal gag order on that one, as I said. I'll talk about it, but I won't pass. I try not to pass judgment on right and wrong, and I'll say things like, the Israel's losing the optics war. That's patently obvious. Right now they don't look very good. And I won't pass judgment on whether what they did was right or wrong, because I don't know what it's like to be an Israeli in the middle of the Middle East, right? I read Victor Davis Hanson's book on collapsed empires, and there was this really interesting take-home messages and he looked at 4 of them, and starting with Thebes, and the invaders, they first set out to conquer their opponents, and it was only sort of partway through the battle that they realized that they wouldn't be safe until they destroyed, vaporized their opponents, and made sure they never came back. And that's sort of the risk we're in today, is this idea that the plot could become more dire just because, let's say, the Arabs decide that they've got to somehow vaporize Israel to solve this problem, or vice versa. I don't know. Mm-hmm. We could end up with even more carnage than we're witnessing right now. Same true in Ukraine, and and our politicians say things that are so shocking. Did you by chance see? Probably not, because I saw almost no comment on social media. Putin did a 3-hour press conference with international press. Now, they're sitting in the headquarters of Gazprom. It's this very luxurious conference room. And they're asking questions that are pretty open-ended. They're kind of like saying, well, what's your take on Israel and Palestine? They're not hammering on detail. Yeah. And for 3 hours, he pontificated about all these random events, and his command of the details and his command of the nuance was so staggering that if you take the time, it's a 3-hour interview. The first thing you ponder is how long could Biden go, and he couldn't get past the greeting without 3x5 cards. And Putin's talking about various threats and various missiles and how they work and what you have to do to bring them down. And I'm going, the level of detail that this guy has is extraordinary. Wow. And it would be like if someone interviewed me on organic chemistry or something for 3 hours, and I guess maybe that's a good analogy because he's a geopolitics guy. But we don't have anyone in the United States who could do. I can't name a single politician that I would be confident could do what Putin did in this interview. I'm almost a Putin fan. I know he's a bad guy. I know he's a sociopath at some level, but he's so much more powerful as a leader. And I don't mean powerful as in militarily. I mean powerful as intellectually. He's so much smarter than any of the leaders in the world that I can see right now. I don't know Xi Jinping, but I do know that he seems smarter than any other leader in the world to me by an order of magnitude. Was this a video? Was it on video or was it all written? No, it was all translated. And so I wonder if he's actually calling that right off the top of his head, or well, so it was a 3-hour meeting, and the guys were sitting right there around a conference table. Yeah. So either they completely faked that, and then there were some very funny exchanges. Like some guy would say, "Well, I have another question, but I'll wait." And Putin says, "I don't think you're going to get another chance. You might as well ask it, right?" And stuff like that. And at the very end, he lost it just a little, where someone said, well, the world has kind of demonized you and has made you out to be a tyrant. And he says, I think it's good that they're afraid of me. Because he'd been very, very measured and based the
Yeah.
whole way.
Mhm.
And they'd ask about stuff. And at one point when he got challenged about, sort of taking over the Warsaw Pact and going against NATO, he says, you think we're going to go against the United States, Britain, Germany, you name it, countries? He says, do you think we're nuts? Right? And I'm going,
Yeah.
of course, right? He's just, I don't know another leader who's got their shit together the way he does. Now he's running a country that's very hard to run. This is not running Switzerland.
Right.
This is running Russia. And he's doing it. He's pulling it off.
Mm-hmm. Well, the media tried to make him out to be nuts when the Ukraine thing started. I mean, that's so he's also kind of referencing that, right?
Yeah,
unprovoked.
In fact, when he did his Tucker Carlson interview, and he did 15 minutes of history of Russia, straight off the top of his head, maybe practiced. I think he did that, first of all, to get a few points across, but I think he was also intentionally juxtaposing his intellectual power against Biden. I think he's going, I'm going to show these guys what a real leader can do.
Yeah.
So that's just my hunch.
Yeah, and if he's got that sort of horsepower, then you've got Biden, who doesn't have anything, and then Trump would sort of just BS it. That would be kind of the three of them. I
have a greater respect
he would
for
let
Trump's
it fly.
intellect, although it's kind of a Trump would BS it. But he reminds me. One time I rode in a cab with a guy from New Jersey, and he was one of these guys who every single thing out of his mouth is a wisecrack. It's like street trash talk.
Yeah.
And at one point I said something intending to sort of join in. He says, "Oh, we got a comedian here, do we?" And it's just one of those things you don't want to go against that guy, right? So Trump has some of that.
Oh yeah, definitely. The Russia stuff kind of reminds me. I think it was you that shared the Jeffrey Sachs interview with Tucker Carlson
on your podcast or on Twitter.
You shared that on Twitter. Which did you listen? You listened to that one, right? Which was pretty amazing. What do you think he's hitting on? What would be some of your takeaways from what he's seeing about how the world works?
Well, so I wrote about Ukraine in 2022, and I looked back, and I'd written about Putin as far back as 2014. My guess is the original writing was in the context of the stress over the CIA-led coup in Ukraine in 2014. I can't remember exactly what it was that triggered it, but every year I seem to find a way to sort of hit Putin. One year I actually had a chapter on Putin and things like that because he's an important player, and he's intrigued me at some level because of his sort of his him riding. That meme of him riding the grizzly bear, right? You've seen it. That is kind of Putin, right? And so Sachs is interesting. Sachs has been fighting a two-front war himself. And one of them, he's been fighting against NATO's support for the Ukraine war, and he's been spot on, in my opinion. So when I listened to Sachs's interview with Carlson, for me, it was an answer key to what I had written. So back in 2022, I wrote what I thought was some of my best writing ever on geopolitics. It might be the best, in my opinion, about the Ukraine war, what was really going on, what caused it, what was really happening. And I found about 50 guys who seemed to be digging in. I started rounding them up. I'd find some guy and I'd dig into his blogs and stuff. And what no one was doing is pulling all of their opinions together into one narrative. So Scott Ritter was doing Scott Ritter, and Sachs was doing Sachs, and I said, okay, let's pull all these guys together. And I actually put some bios of the key players and stuff like that into the write-up. And so Sachs, in my opinion, has been calling it perfectly. When in his podcast with Carlson, which I urge your readers to go back and watch, he tells this story that had the hair on my arm standing up, where he's sitting with Yeltsin in the Kremlin, and Gorbachev's still in charge. And Yeltsin gets a phone call, and he leaves the room, and he comes back, and he says to Sachs, do you know who's in the room next door? And there's rhetorical, and Sachs says no. And he says, the generals, the Russian generals in the room next door, they just voted to dissolve the Soviet Union. And I'm sitting going, oh my God, it was just riveting. And Sachs goes through about 2 hours of great campfire stories, and they're legit. They're legit. He's not making this shit up. The second front was he chaired a committee, and they blew it. They boned this one. They started talking about COVID and forgot to mention that Sachs chaired the committee to find out where the virus came from. He had on his committee Peter Daszak. Peter, flush him down some volcano, Daszak, right? The guy who I think was pivotal in creating the virus. And it took him months. I think he even quotes like 9 months, maybe not in that interview, but another interview. It took him months to figure out that his committee was lying their asses off to him. The committee was stacked with people designed to cover up the origin. And in some sense, I don't want to be derogatory, but in some sense, I get the feeling Sachs at some levels kind of naive in that his default setting is a Gladwellian default to trust. And he's in a world where everybody's lying.
Yeah.
And so I think Sachs believed Daszak until Daszak proved he was not trustworthy. And so he talks about that too. So it sounds like just a couple of guys talking about the virus, not realizing, no, you're getting kind of a ground zero presentation of the virus story. And he's
I didn't know that.
And battling the lockdown and so I've reached out to him a couple times. These are perfunctory little chats. And I was going to congratulate him on it. I said, nah, his email box is probably full. And then I had a 2-hour talk with one of his peers, a guy named Steve Hanke, who's a currency expert. And so whenever a country goes to shit, either Sachs or Hanke gets called in, right? And probably both of them. I'm not sure they get along well. But I spent 2 hours on the phone with Hanke, and I'd sent Sachs's interview to Hanke and said, you really ought to listen to Sachs, even though you guys are kind of competitors. It was, by the way, it was a very satisfying discussion with Steve Hanke, too, because we did a lot of note comparing, what's your take on this, what's your take on that. And I was feeling pretty good about not having boned it because so in any event, so I reached out to Sachs again and sent him the Putin press conference. I said, on the off chance, which I don't think is an off chance because it was so buried, you can't even find it on Twitter. It's very hard to find on Twitter even.
It's crazy.
I said, on the off chance you have seen this 3 hours is worth your time to read this thing. It's just unbelievable what Putin did. And so I post on Twitter, and I'll write about that at some point and things like that. So, yeah. So I'm geopolitics has got my attention. I think the economy is rolling over finally in earnest, and the reason we don't know it for sure is because of the election year.
Why? What are you seeing in the economy rolling over that? All the numbers are made to look fine usually. So what you have to do is you have to look at the numbers that are too small to be worth rigging. And so you don't look at the national jobs numbers, you look at some state job numbers or something like that. So you have to look at indicators that are below the radar where you don't have political forces saying make those numbers better. And in fact, I just saw a tweet today that said Powell admitted that the jobs numbers are not accurate. Oh, really?
Well, the problem he has is I think he's gearing up to cut rates, and he's got to justify them.
Oh, yeah.
And if the fake jobs numbers are being spewed out there, then you say, well, why would you cut rates? The job numbers are great. How can you justify that?
Yeah.
So I actually think that Powell, they talk about Powell being a political animal and, him supporting Biden and whatever. And I don't believe it. I think Powell must be so pissed off at Biden at this point.
Yeah.
Because he's got a tough job and Biden's not making it easier. And I listened to Grant Williams do a podcast with Mike Ferris. And it's always weird when I get talked about in a podcast. They open with that. It makes it hard for me to sell the podcast. I'd love to say, you got to watch this. But when the first 2 minutes are talking about Dave, then I kind of can't do that. But Grant and I go pretty far back, actually, probably back to, 2009. We met around 2012 and a number of times since then. But he was talking about our election cycle from afar. Mm-hmm. And he was pretty careful to straddle the midline, saying, talk about Trump doing what Trump does and Biden doing what Biden does. But he was saying you can't possibly look at Biden and think that he has the minimum necessary requirements to be a world leader. He's just gone. And he really is. Yeah. He's gone. I mean, it's and you should feel bad for him, except for the fact that I think when he wasn't gone, he was such a twisted fuck anyways.
Yeah.
That I don't feel remorse about saying he's gone. Good riddance. And I think his wife is despicable for not pulling him off the stage. If you're losing your marbles, your wife should be saying, "Come on, let's Mr. McLaughlin, it's time to get off the goddamn stage." Right?
I know. It must be terrible being around him because it's constantly just trying to make him look like he's not senile all the time and making all these decisions about how do we prop him up. It's going to be stressful if there's any empathy.
You see it everywhere, whether it's the Easter egg celebration where you've got a person in a bunny outfit, in theory humoring the kids, but when Joe's got to be led somewhere, the Easter bunny is the one leading him there, and you're going, oh boy. Wonder what Secret Service agent drew that job. And there's one where where they're marching along with troops, and the guy who's marching with Biden, this very straight-laced military guy, but he's using his hand to point to Biden where to go, and he's making it look military. But it's really saying, get the fuck over in this direction, Joe. And then there's the funniest meme where he gets off the helicopter. I love memes. He gets off the helicopter, and it sounds like a military guy on a microphone. He says, "Okay, the Eagle has landed," that sort of thing. And he goes out, and he made it down the stairs. It was tricky, and then he narrates it. And you can see the guy at the end of the walk, and right when Biden gets within about 5 feet of the walk, the guy puts his hand out to the left saying, "Go this way." And then as soon as Biden gets within a foot or two, the guy takes his hand down and starts to go that direction. And Biden walks right off into the yard. And the guy's narrating, and I'm laughing my ass off. But that's the knucklehead we have running the country, which means he's not running it. But Glenn Greenwald made this fantastic analysis where he said, when you have no one person, no buck stops at the top guy, and you're doing it by committee, you have, things like Cuban Missile Crisis, you get a different outcome.
Mm-hmm. Right?
So.
Is there another time period in U.S. history or other empires' histories that compare to today? I mean, we've got a guy that's dying in office of essentially old age, and then we've got the other guy's really old too. He's in much better shape, but we've got these two super old guys. I mean, is anything comparable in history to today?
Yeah. It turns out the Fourth Crusade was led by a 94-year-old blind guy.
What?
Yeah, I heard that Hansen said
no
that.
Way, really?
Yeah, a 94-year-old blind guy. Now, I think led is a relative term. They carried him around. He was there. Yeah, come on, follow us. You're going with us.
Yeah.
And so yeah, but I'm not sure that crusades are a good analogy. It's hard for me to say. I'm still expanding my historical base, trying to understand stuff like this. But there's a power shift going on, and it's slow. I think it may be inevitable. I think we're going to rot our way sort of down a British Empire like path, and our debt problems are very real. I listened to a bunch of Bitcoin guys talking about how the dollar's not going to collapse. I actually think, of all people to miss it, these guys shouldn't. But the dollar won't collapse necessarily relative to other currencies, but the global currencies could all collapse. Like if you've got 20% inflation in every currency, the dollar's not collapsing by the metric of, the Forex market. Yeah.
But it's collapsing against gold or things you need or anything
sliced
useful.
Turkey. Anyone listening to this podcast, if you're the shopper in the family, you undoubtedly remember when sliced turkey was, $4.99 a pound. And if you're feeling spunky, you might go for the sliced roast beef for $6.99 a pound. I used to get prime rib for nine something at a store where you buy a 4-pack. Sliced turkey, all brands, not just some designer brand. It was not a fancy dollar. This is a grocery store the other day I went to. It was $14 a pound.
Oh man.
And I'm pretty affluent by most standards, and I look at that and I go, I'm not buying that.
Yeah.
Just out of principle.
Yep.
I don't mind paying top dollar for top quality. I hate getting ripped off, and I know I'm not getting ripped off. That's the price of creating turkey now. But I go, screw it. I'm not buying that. And the ground beef is now $4.99 a pound.
Yep. Yes, I'm like finally old enough. I'm in my mid-30s, and I was talking to a friend about this the other day, where you remember your parents talking about how much cheaper things were when they were kids. Like how
kids?
a candy.
I can't remember. Do you have kids?
Yeah, I have two little kids.
So you're officially an adult when you are in an age where your kids are an age where you remember your parents because they were adults. So you can't delude yourself anymore.
Yeah, no, exactly.
When you are your parents' age.
But I remember them saying, a candy bar used to cost a nickel, and now they're $2.50 or something. And now I finally see that with the push of the last 4 years since COVID with the money printing. I finally am there where I look at things and I'm like, are you serious? I just filled one grocery bag and it's $120.
That is amazing. My mother used to work on a grocery budget of $40 a week.
Man, how many kids? 2.
Family of 4, $40 a week. $10 a person.
Wow. Yeah.
Well, I wrote a blog once for what I like to refer to as an obscure Harvard professor, where I describe how I used to caddy, and I could make $10 in 4 hours, which meant $2.50 an hour. And I happened to remember, just by chance, buying an extra large pizza, not from some Domino's bullshit, but some Italian guy winging it in the air, big ass plain pizza for $2. And so I was being paid as a 13-year-old 1.25 pizzas per hour. Now, as I've described that to unpolite company, I would have to get blowjobs behind a dumpster at Wendy's to make that kind of money now, right? And as a 13-year-old, and so I could caddy during the summer a few times a week, and then have spending money all year.
Yeah.
And that just isn't possible now. And so this blog, she posted it, and then we used to chat late at night. It turns out it was Elizabeth Warren.
Really?
I have all these emails from Elizabeth Warren from before she got famous. I've got emails of her when she became TARP oversight chair, and we're exchanging late night. We just 11:30, 12 at night. One of us would pass an email along and say, "Oh, I don't know if you saw this. I sent her the one that really blew her circus was you get a credit card of which you could charge against your 401k. And, her circuit just melted. I thought she was a very decent person. She seems to have taken to the swamp way too aggressively. And I don't know if it was always there and I misread her, or if it's just a corrupting world. But she's not the person I used to chat with.
Also, everyone agrees there's something wrong. And she's decided to blame the banks and greed, like corporate greed, essentially, right, on why things cost more instead of the money printing. I mean, is that a fair?
There's that. Although I think her antagonism to the banks is still, there's validity to that. The banks are a powerful entity, and they fuck up and then they get bailed out, and she's been fighting that. So when she was going against the banks during the primaries in 2016. Every time she started going against the banks, her numbers would go up. Mm-hmm. And somehow, when Bloomberg was trying to take over, they were trying to find someone who could beat Trump, right? Mm-hmm. And when Bloomberg was in there and she'd be attacking Bloomberg, her numbers would go up.
Let's see.
And so she's a swamp creature now, and I don't know how much she really exploited the American Indian thing. I could imagine she was told by her grandmother she was Indian. The odds of having Indian blood as a kid from Oklahoma is not small.
Yeah, that's true.
Right? So if grandma says, yeah, you're part Native American, I was told my grandmother was part Indian. So I could imagine saying it. But I didn't lose get a job because of it, things like that. And the claim is she did, although I'd have to see the evidence. I was on a podcast with Mike Ferris. We do about one every 3 weeks now. I think we just record our conversations. And,
that's awesome.
And he would say, well, they're getting mad at this. People are getting upset about this. I said, are you sure? Or is the press telling you they're getting mad at this, right? Mm-hmm. I read that the Republicans are trying to get rid of birth control. And I go, are you sure? And the answer is no. Mm-hmm. And I did a Twitter poll to find out what people thought. And, no. The answer is no. They're not trying to get rid of birth control.
Yep. Yeah. We're in a weird spot where you have the media that's manipulated and they say one thing. Then you have the internet, which is not actually a representation of the people. It's the people that choose to have an account and choose to say things behind a screen. And then you have the third is actually what people think. So you have three competing things that could all tell you things are very different on the same topic.
Well, so here's the question. There's the people who ride social media and the people who do not. And their worldviews tend to be profoundly different.
Right.
Right. So I don't think you could possibly be hanging out on Twitter a lot and somehow think that Biden's a good president. I don't see how that would get by you. Right. And whereas if you're just parking it with dinner in front of MSNBC every night to find out what Joe Scarborough thinks, right, or whatever, you're going to have a very different view of the world. Yeah. And you're not going to believe what you're told by someone else who's got different sources. Yeah.
This is, I don't know, do you read about the AI stuff at all? Because this is...
a lot.
This to me, and I want to hear your take, but somebody said this about AI, like one of the main flaws in AI, it's that it's basically a summation of everything said on the internet. And what's said on the internet is not a summation of what people actually say. It's just a different group of people saying it in a different way because they're not face to face. And that really stuck with me because if you're basically rounding up everything on the internet and turning it into like a robotically written piece, you actually will probably miss it anyhow.
Now that in theory could be AI 1.0, right? That could be the primordial AI. So it could improve. I'm agnostic as to whether AI will be a net gain or loss for society. and I can see I can see significant probability of it being a big loss. The gain is not so obvious to me, because taking the human element out, I don't think is a win. I just don't think there's things that should be done by non-humans. I don't want to read an article that's scraped from the internet.
No,
I don't. I want to read an analysis from Glenn Greenwald. I want to know what he's thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want to, would you be happy if you never, ever saw another AI generated piece of artwork?
Yes.
Right?
Yeah, I would.
That art is just so lacking in personality. And it's the only thing that makes it interesting is it's what AI scrapings created. So in some sense, it's holding a mirror up to us and saying, this, according to your chatter on the internet, this is the answer. But and then there was that scandal where I think it was Gemini, where whenever you asked them to make a picture of anything, the person ended up being black.
Yeah,
right? Remember that scandal? Yeah. So they say, give me a picture of a bunch of Vikings, and they were black and Chinese and all sorts of stuff. And then someone posted a meme. Again, I love memes. And it showed a picture of a black bear, and it just said, it's an AI-generated polar bear.
Yeah.
And that's what I want to see. I want to see the guy who comes up with that clever idea.
Yeah.
I want to see the tweet where the guy shows a shark coming out of the water looking really mean, and it says a rare photo of a shark stepping on a Lego. You've got a half a million likes, right? I want to. That's what I want to see. I want to see the clever stuff, and I don't want to see AI shit. And several times now, I've been talking to someone on the phone and been wrestling with whether they are real or not.
Really?
Yeah.
I don't think I've had that yet. Wow.
Twice I've had it. One, I kept saying, look, I don't understand what you mean by this word. And it was not capable of saying, the person was not, whatever it was not capable of saying, okay, think of it this way, right? There was no, it just kept going back into a loop. Mm-hmm. And I'm going, wait a minute, this person's not acting like a person. And then the other, I ordered a pizza from Papa John's, and the guy was so polite. But I kept getting those little cues that told me it was misreading what I was saying.
Yeah. And
it didn't sound like a human error. You didn't hear the human fuck up. I'm sorry. I fucked it up. Okay, say it again. You didn't hear the humanity in it. And that's an economy. That's an efficiency, I think. But and I don't buy the argument that you're taking away a job and therefore, because that argument always gets made, and historically it never holds up, right?
Yeah.
The buggy whip makers are not lost. We're not hurt because we don't have buggy whip makers. But I think the quality of service is seriously at risk, and we're at serious risk of being. I did a poll. I asked the question. Some economist was talking about the efficiency of working at home. So the commercial real estate market's collapsing. That's one of the economic indicators, right?
Sure is.
And they're saying, look, it's not coming back, not in the same form, because there's an economy of working at home, and I don't work well at home. Mm-hmm. When I was a kid, when I was in college, I realized, Dave, leave your dorm room, go up to the library if you want to get some work done. Don't hang out in your dorm. And so I learned that, when I go home, I used to work I used to work ridiculous hours, 18-hour days when I was an assistant professor. And I was in my office. I didn't go home and work at night at home. The fact that we now all have computers and stuff allows us to do more work than we're supposed to do. So if I have a 9-to-5 job, it's staggering how much you'll still do after that. because you say, oh, I really got to do this for tomorrow, right? And so you're donating your time.
Yep.
And so there's that. So you're donating your free personal time to your employer when you do that. On the positive side, I occasionally talk to young women who occasionally say, well, I don't want to go into academics because I want to have a family and have a life. And I go, wait, I don't know a better job than being an academic and having a family, because if my kid is sick, I just say, fuck it and go home. My wife was having surgery in New York City, had her spine fused. And I just told my class, I'm going to be out for 2 weeks. See you later. And no one was going to say you can't do that.
Yeah.
You know, they might have, but they're going, I'm not going to tell Dave that, because for one thing, he's wrestling with having his wife having a spine fusion.
Yeah.
And so you just do it. And you say, oh, fuck, I can't be here on Friday. I'm having my bladder stone taken out. You just don't go. And if your kid's sick, you go home and you take care of the kid. And you work at night. And you breastfeed at home. And, you know, there's all sorts of gains for women.
Yep.
And so, but I don't think working at home is more efficient, because the refrigerator calls you all the time, you know, talking to you. There's distractions, you know, you're sitting there trying to get something done, and your wife says, oh, could you come unscrew this cap? You know, there's just a lot of things to distract you.
So the benefits of, which I do it well. I'm also have an office. I'm in my office now. So I do a little bit of both. I'm in the office 3 or 4 mornings a week and at home some of the time, which I think having the flexibility, if it's doable, is the best. The upside to the remote work stuff, I agree, is not necessarily individually working home. It's on the flip side from the business. You go from a hiring radius of 50 miles around Boston to a hiring radius around the world, right? Which you could find somebody much better somewhere else. You could find somebody the same for much cheaper. Then you don't have the overhead of this huge office space that you need to fill.
And you're not commuting.
There's tons of You're not commuting or not forced to commute essentially at the same time all together 5 days a week.
And you've got CEOs who, you know, so my son works at the Council on Foreign Relations. He organizes the events from Dublin, New Hampshire. He ran them from Uruguay for 2 years.
That's crazy.
And he just basically, you know, played the keyboard saying, okay, you do this, you do this, you do this. And he'd order the shit for some gala or whatever at the council. And so that worked really well. So there is advantage. And if you want to get all the big mucky mucks together, it's a lot easier to just put them all on a Zoom call than to fly them all into New York City.
Yep. Yeah, I think with the commercial real estate collapsing, and specifically office space, which some of these are like, have you seen some of these deals like 90% down? You know,
yes.
Some bank bought it for $300 million 4 years ago, and now they're selling it for $30 million, or like some of these.
Well, even more horrifying,
insane.
I think a lot of those losses are being swallowed inside pension funds too. I think the pension funds during 0% interest rates did a reach for yield. And so some Wall Street guy packaged up a tranche of bullshit and said, oh, I can get you 5% risk free, right?
Yeah.
And all of a sudden the pension fund's left holding the bag. You know, Kentucky pension fund at one point was funded at 22%. I don't know where it is now, but I do know it's not 100. That is a guarantee. It's probably not even 40. And we're at the end of a pretty good run. Someone said, look, they didn't just make bad investments. They got robbed. They got taken.
Because of the COVID policies? Is that what you mean?
No, because Wall Street can play any state pension fund manager.
Oh, I see.
Wall Street knows the crap they're selling. The pension managers don't. It was a wake-up call for me. I have TIA Craft as one of my many accounts, but and I was listening. It might have been Liar's Poker or something. I don't know, one of those older books, and they said there was $100 million, which is a quaint number, of debt that they were trying to sell, and it wouldn't sell. And the manager says, "Why isn't it selling?" So he sits there and he's listening into the call, trying to figure out why it's not being taken. And then they said, and then they solved the whole thing. They sold the whole thing to TIAA, and I'm going, "Oh fuck! Don't tell me that."
Oh man.
Right. And so for all we know, that these pension funds are about to blow up because the banks learned not to carry it on their balance sheets. So they sold it off to pension funds, private equity. And
not good.
Like when Silicon Valley, I'm a contrarian, right? I think I thrive being a contrarian, and that if I detect that I'm not a contrarian, then I'm not happy. And I defend Silicon Valley Bank. And a lot of people said, "Oh, they totally blew it. You know, they didn't do this, they didn't do that." And I go, let me see if I got this right. You're saying that a bank went insolvent because it bought too many treasuries? So there's this flood of cash into the bank, and they had to do something with it, and they bought treasuries, and that's the mistake they made, right? Please tell me how a bank is supposed to function in that world if you can't buy treasuries. And they said, "Well, they didn't hedge them." I said, "Okay, who was going to take the other side of that bet?"
Yeah.
And I go, "Some other bank?" No. How about some private equity guys taking the other side? Yeah. You know what they're going to do? They're going to borrow from Silicon Valley Bank to take the other side of the bet.
Yeah.
Right. So you can't hedge risk. You can hedge risk on a local base. You can't hedge it systemically. And so maybe Silicon Valley Bank blew it by not finding a patsy. I defend Yellen for selling short-term debt. I just watched John Kennedy, the senator, hammering her. And I think her arguments were sound. But I had a second argument, and that is you drive rates to the basement. You make it say, what the 30-year get down to 3%? Something like that?
Something crazy.
Some very low number. And one side of my brain says, well, it's a good time to sell 3% debt, 3% yielding 30-year debt. But you also know that therefore the government's making the decision to totally fuck those people.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the idea that someone might say maybe we shouldn't do that would be so extraordinarily thoughtful. And you can blame them for not doing what they're supposed to do, and that is maximize the business model of the federal government. But it bothers me that they would artificially drive rates down and then sell a wad of 30-year debt after doing that. Right? That, if you want to sell it to China, go, good riddance. I don't care. You just lost the geopolitical battle.
Well, was that part of it, that they probably couldn't get people to buy those longer term ones?
I'm sure
especially China.
It was not that morality, right? So my moral argument is not the reason they didn't do it.
Yeah.
But it still is a moral argument for me. I still think the idea of driving rates down artificially and then selling a wad of 30-year debt at those stupid rates. Here's the question I like to ask people. I might ask you in the last interview. I never know. But if I said to you, young punk, Henry, I said, you got a lot of years ahead of you. I want to sell you a 30-year treasury. And you can't sell it. There's no market for it. It's illiquid. You're buying it in 30 years. Over the next 30 years, you will make a set interest rate. You don't know the future. You're not allowed to hedge it, right? This is just an artificial story, therefore, because you could, in theory, hedge it. And I said, based on all the things you don't know, all the risks you don't know about, the risk of inflation, the risk of deflation, you name it, what % would you demand to say, deal. I'll take my savings and buy that treasury.
It would be very high.
Give me
very high. 20%.
It wouldn't be 4.
No, it would not. That would be an absolute no. I mean,
which tells you, therefore, that the treasury market is priced wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And it tells you, and people say, well, you don't buy a treasury to hold on to it. And I said, someone is supposed to hold on to that. If you're telling me these things are just being sold to trade, that tells us we're already humped. They are supposed to be the purchase of a revenue stream.
Yeah.
And the artificial purchasers come from statutory requirements to buy treasuries. So that insurance companies have to, by law, buy treasuries. And that they come from the artificial purchasers of saying, look, by the way, Saudi Arabia, you have to buy them if you want to sell us oil, and we're going to send you weapons.
Right.
Right? And
it's
China
all artificial demand.
The whole thing is artificial. It's not about buying a revenue stream. If it was, they would agree with you. 20 may be too high. I think it is too high. I'd go for less than 20, but it wouldn't be a single digit.
No, it wouldn't.
And therefore, that market is not priced correctly, in my opinion.
But how could it possibly be priced correctly with?
It can't.
Yeah. No.
But since everything else cues off it, that means that the debt markets are priced wrong. Mm-hmm. Which is why we're in a constant state of bailout. Which is why our debt is soaring.
Yeah.
Why not spend like a drunken sailor when you provide the free liquor and the free money? Here's a Gedanken experiment. If, let's say, some state governor or some federal agency said, we want to help Ithaca. Or you can say, we want to help Detroit. Pick a city, but say that we want to help Ithaca. We are going to provide everybody in the town of Ithaca $50,000 interest-free loan that you don't have to pay back for 10 years. What would you observe? Well, you'd observe a lot of things. One is you'd observe new cars appearing. You'd observe spending patterns that would all of a sudden justify having 4 big box lumber yards instead of what Ithaca doesn't need more than 2. And you'd observe people putting additions on their houses. You'd observe restaurants thriving. And then in 10 years, everyone has to pay it back. You'd observe a depression.
Yeah, definitely.
So you just pulled consumption forward with the debt. Debt is pulling consumption forward. It is consumption you can't do in the future.
Yeah.
Overvalued markets are pulling appreciation forward. It's appreciation you can't get in the future. The markets are 150% overvalued, which I think they are. Then it means that you're either going to get a 3% return for the rest of eternity, which, by the way, inflation adjusts that puppy and tell me how that works. Or you are going to get clobbered at some point when they finally regress back to a normal pricing.
This is something we talked about last time, and I want to ask you about. But how? I know you're saying they're 150% overvalued, but if they from 2020 to 2022 or whatever it was, they printed, the M2 money supply increased by 40% in like 2 or 3 years. 40%. And that's not like getting evenly distributed to all 360
not at all.
Americans or something.
The Cantillon effect.
Yes. So a lot of that's going to just nestle into assets in the stock market.
Jeff Bezos's pockets.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally. And Nvidia and all that stuff. So but if that's happening, that additional money printing that is just settling into the stock market, couldn't it just stay overvalued? That's the part I'm not getting. Why wouldn't it just be overvalued? Why would it need to come back to some fair value from years ago?
So if you pay twice as much for an asset, and to the extent that you're buying assets as a revenue return, you will get half the revenue return. Think of it as a bond.
Yeah.
Right? If you buy a bond for twice as much, you're going to get half the return percent basis. So we're priced now for in perpetuity 3% return in equities. Now, and you say, well, what's historical fair value? Well, first of all, the fair value question is one should not confuse price of the markets with the valuation of the markets, right? And a lot of people do. It's like a lot of people confuse inflation with prices. Inflation is inherently a rate, right? And prices. So people say, why is inflation going up? And I go, it's not. The prices are going up. Inflation is actually potentially coming down, right?
Yeah.
And there's people who first derivative, second derivative confusion or something, right? So, any valuation metric that's worth a damn takes the price of the market, divides by something that it should track, meaning something that follows the same inflationary metric as the markets. And so, for example, what would be the best inflation metric of them all? Well, we know it's not CPI, right?
No.
So if you correct the markets for CPI, you're in a state of you're Joe Biden at that point, right? You're brain dead. And then there's the Chapwood Index. Now, I have a gripe about the Chapwood Index and John Williams' shadow stats. And the reason is if you accept their high inflation numbers and you sort of back calculate and say, therefore, cars have increased this much over the last 30 years, you go, but they haven't. So somehow things are, the shadow stat says inflation running at like 12% a year for eternity, it seems. And things haven't gone up 12% a year either, right? So I think if they're a little bit off, then they're compounding at too high a rate. So somewhere between the CPI and shadow stats is the right number, I think. The Chapwood Index is the cleanest looking one to me. That's one where they take 10 cities. A guy named Batowski does it. Takes 10 cities and monitors 500 prices. Now, cities might have been in a more inflationary period than the country as a whole. I don't know. I'm just saying they might. A coin toss for me. But if you look at real estate in the cities, it's gone bananas. So you can imagine. But Batowski comes up with 12% a year for quite a few years, at least a dozen years. And so inflation is clearly way out of control compared to what the CPI shows. Now, I just learned something the other day. Something clicked the other day, and I give David Rosenberg credit. The economists like to use jerry-rigged looking inflation metrics, so they'll call it core inflation or whatever. At one point, Krugman used one that said, take out food, energy, and housing. And I go, there's nothing left, you fucking moron. I don't care how many Nobel Prizes they give you. You're a moron, right?
Yeah.
But Rosenberg said something that's very important. He says economists like to focus. He says there are sticky inflation numbers where inflation goes up every year no matter what. And you go, the problem with that is to an economist, it has no information in it. It doesn't tell you if the economy is strong or weak. It just tells you that those things are relentlessly going up, and it's a problem. We'll get to that in a second. But it doesn't have information where an economist would like to look at things that if the economy is going well, go up. If the economy is doing poorly, they go down, and they go, look at that.
Yeah.
That inflation metric is dropping. We're in a deflationary region there. It might be car rentals, might be who knows what, right? And so they take the subset of what we consume that can go up and down with the economy, and they give that some core-like name. And they all have their favorite choice. The problem is, so the consumer says, oh, you're saying inflation's 3.5%. My ass is 3.5%. There's no chance it's 3.5%. But the economists are excluding the things that don't have information content. And therefore, they say, oh, we are now in a deflationary situation here, indicating the economy is rolling over. Now, but the economists are failing to understand if they're doing this. And I think this is what they're doing. They're failing to give lip service to the difference between those two. And it wasn't until Rosenberg said that, that was like 4 days ago, I go, oh, I got it now. So the economists don't understand. It's like when they call January 6th an insurrection. Mm-hmm. If you read the legal definition of an insurrection, you can kind of make that case. There is a definition of an insurrection. The problem is, if you call it an insurrection without saying, and here's the definition, that no one else uses, but we're using it because this is what it is in some court system, then you're misleading. And so the power of defining what you're counting is very important. Now, economists were stunned when stagflation showed up in the 70s. I remember this vividly. Even as a kid, they thought that you couldn't have a stagnant economy and have inflation. And I'm sitting there going, let me see if I got this right. I wrote this, I think, last year maybe, but I said, what you're saying is if I can buy less with my paycheck than I could buy the year before because of inflation. Mm-hmm. That's not stagnating the economy? I mean, how could that not be true?
Right.
But they were looking at the core shit. They were, I think, I might be wrong. I might be giving them too much credit. They're still boning it, but more understandably.
Also, do you know Jeff Booth?
Yes.
Bitcoiner. You ever listen to him? I just had him on my podcast.
I did a podcast with him.
Did you? Okay.
Yeah, the hodlers have all tried to get me to convert.
I know that. Yeah.
They show up at my door in a suit and a Bible under their arm. And,
no, totally. No, I agree, and I'm one of them. But I agree with you. but it's changing, though. It is slowly but surely. I just listened to a Twitter Spaces this morning, and it was about Bitcoin, and I would say cooler heads are prevailing now in the Bitcoin space. And I'll tell you what and Vinny Lingham, who follows me on Twitter, which you guys know Lingham, right? The guy's I don't know who that is. No.
Oh, he's got like 350,000 followers. He's big in the Bitcoin space, and he's been quiet. I think he's been quiet, but he was talking, and he said you got to pay attention to the macro. The macroeconomic situation will influence Bitcoin. And I'm going, finally, someone gets this. Here's what Bitcoin has never experienced: a downturn. Bitcoin was a twinkle in some NSA guy's eyes during our last downturn. When did Bitcoin finally show up and people started actually talking about it, right? 2009? So
that's when it came out.
Right. I did an interview with Lauren Lister on Russia Today, which I was shocked when I drove to DC to do it. And I actually went to our media guys. Said, I've never done a TV interview. Could you help me out here? And they filmed me and said, okay, you're doing fine. You have no idiosyncrasies. I remember thinking no one has ever said that to me before. And they said, this is big, And I go, what do you mean? And they said, this station reaches 350 million setup boxes. I go, what? Right? And so I went down to Lauren Lister and did a half-hour interview, and we were talking about Bitcoin. And I think it was sitting at like $5 a coin at the time, right?
Wow.
And, well, I remember when it was even cheaper, some guy, some guy was pissed off that he sold all his Bitcoin, and now it's $8, and he can't believe he sold it.
Yeah.
And so here my take on Bitcoin now is that, well, first of all, revolutions are always the foot soldiers are youngsters. So the fact that the boomers aren't signing off on it in no way, shape, or form means it's not a revolution.
Mm-hmm.
And so the guys who were leading the charge, they had to get used to the idea that it was a bunch of young punks doing it.
Yeah.
And at the same time, it created the most naive investor class in history. Because they didn't know anything about market structure. They didn't know, so many of them didn't know anything about the ebbs and flows of markets and how you can really get hurt and how you can really get crushed and how it can take off when you don't expect it and how you can't trade the way you think you can trade it, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say it's maturing.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm still not interested in it, but I will be watching it very, very carefully in the next serious downturn, the next serious credit crunch-driven downturn. We both know one's coming. And I don't know if it's going to be 2024, 2025 or whatever. Yeah. But even they were still naive. They were still naive on this podcast. They were talking about, when Powell starts dropping rates, I think that's going to be good news.
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out you can dispel that rumor by just look at what happened in the last two serious downturns. It turns out if you overlay, and you can do that, just search S&P 500 and Fed funds rate. What you can see is that to the day that the Fed started cutting rates, that marks the top, not the bottom.
Yeah.
The last two big, 2000, 2008, the Fed funds rates, when it starts going down, the markets sell off round number 50% from that point on. That's not always been true. But when it wasn't true before, the markets weren't maniacal like they are now. So I don't know there's some cases where it isn't true, but 2007 and 2000, that's exactly what the hell happened. Now, someone described the markets as a great description. The markets are like watching a bunch of 5-year-olds play soccer.
Yeah.
They're all just chasing the ball. There's no defense. There's no one in the goal. There's nothing.
No.
Right?
That's great.
And that's what we have to shake out of the system. So a real correction's got to take investors' attitudes back to earth. Now, the question is, what's fair value? And you say, well, if you want to redefine fair value, you have to redefine expected returns. Right? So if I want to say fair value is a PE of 6, then I can also say expected returns are 15%. I mean, it's that simple, right? Yeah. It's the price of a bond. Think of it as the price of a bond.
Yeah.
The way you set fair value is you divide by something that should track the markets. What would be the best? And by the way, any economist who tracks something who doesn't inflation adjust should lose their paycheck. You really ought to inflation adjust everything. Now, the question is what's the best? Well, you got the CPI, you got Chapwood. I finally circle back to this. Arguably, the best inflation correction of them all would be to correct the markets for the M2 money supply.
Exactly. That is the definition of inflation. Right? That's the original definition. Right. The inflation of the money supply.
Have you ever seen that plot?
What?
It's a plot of the markets. It's the markets back to 1880, I think, corrected for the M2 money supply.
Denominated in the M2, right? Yeah.
Denominated, It turns out the markets have dropped since 1880. Dropped.
Yeah, that's crazy. That's insane.
Corrected for the M2 money supply. Might not be 18. That one might be in 1925. But in any event, the markets, inflation corrected by M2, are down over the last 100 years. Yeah. Which means that the only money you really made were dividends. Now, what were the dividends over that period? And it turns out the answer is around 3.5 to 4% on average. They're much higher in the early part of the century, and they steadily dropped because people said, who wants dividends anyways, right? It's like the farmer saying, who needs to harvest the corn anyways? I just need my property value to go up. Right?
Yeah, right.
It turns out that that 3.79% return. So the guy who did this is a guy named Ron Grice, and he's a chartaholic. He runs the chart store, and he just makes charts for a living. and he sent me a modified version. He said, here is the total return of the market over the same time period, corrected for M2 money supply, not just the capital gains. And that's where the 3.79% return comes from. Now, in Buffett's 1999 Fortune article, which is, if people haven't read it, they're missing one of the most important articles ever written on finance. 1999 Fortune. Buffett wrote about what makes markets go up and down. And it's interest rates. He says it's 100% interest rates. If over a long secular period of time, rates are going up, you're going to get hurt. And if over a long period of time, rates are going down, you're going to win big. And he talks about the bear market from 67 to 81. He said the GDP actually grew quite well, but interest rates went from a low value to 16% or something. Yeah. He says from 81 to 99, the GDP did not grow as well, but interest rates went down.
Yeah.
And we had a bull market. He said the most you can expect to return after all the fees and everything are accounted for, but not taxes, because it's too hard to do taxes because everyone's taxes are different. But without taxes, but with fees and things like that, he said is about a 4% return. Tell me how many investors believe that. That turns out to match pretty well the 3.79% that Grice comes up with it on his total return M2 adjusted. And by the way, who else says that? I think Druckenmiller quoted that same number.
Yeah.
And so what's fair value? How do you define fair value? Well, I noticed something I've never seen anyone else notice. Although I'm sure they've noticed it, but I have put a date on it. If you plot the markets from 1980 to the present, they took off and left orbit in what I refer to as 1994. Okay. So they're in this channel going back and forth, and market valuations should go up and down, but they shouldn't trend. Yeah. Unless you want to argue that you're willing to let, if they trend up, then it means that your returns from those markets eventually have to trend down in the same way. You can't get rich buying Toyotas for $100,000. It just doesn't work. Yeah. And so if you watch the markets from 1880 to 1994, it's like channeling stocks.com. It just wobbles back and forth and back and forth. And so you take the mean of that. And that's fair value. That seems like a good metric. From 1994, in which I estimate it was about 50% above the mean, but then that's when it left the channel. Yeah. I keep using hand signals off screen. That's when it left the channel. So it went from 50% over fair value to out of orbit, and it never returned. In 2009, it spent about a month below historical fair value. About a month. Wow. And everyone thought, and that seemed like a swan dive. Yeah. But it just barely scraped along. It didn't even go seriously below fair value. And you go, oh, are you sure you're right, Dave? Well, Mark Spitznagel told me that too. And Jeremy Grantham has quoted that too. Neither of these guys is as poorly informed as me. And so we have had 4 decades of phenomenal tailwinds and 3 decades of out of the stratosphere valuations. And people think this is normal. And it won't be. And what just ended? A 40-year credit cycle. Maybe it didn't end, but it sure acts like it did, right?
So is that, you mean like boot up 16% interest rates to zero over 40 years.
From 16 down to zero. And it was in a channel. It was as though the Fed knew that we could tap the rates down incrementally. We can squeeze a number of decades of growth out of this.
Seriously.
It's almost like they knew that they could dial in a positive result if they don't overdo it, and they just kind of slowly. I bought a house at 13.5%. I bought a house at 16.5% interest rates. And what did that mean? Well, it meant the house was cheap.
Yeah, exactly.
Because if you have to pay a high rate, you can't buy much house. And so that sets the price of real estate. High rates, low prices. It just works that way.
Yeah.
So when you really want to buy a house is when the rates are high. And then refinance it. Or the perfect play, which didn't seem like it at the time, was to get a 30-year adjustable. It would have just adjusted its way down, right? So then I bought another house, and the rates were at 13.5%. And that happened to be a period when they were dropping so quickly that by the time I closed, it was 9.5%. From the purchase offer to the point that I closed on the house, I probably had about a 30% return on that house because the rates were dropping so quickly. And then we got to these low levels, and now, and then the doofuses on Wall Street, the talking heads, were almost without fail guys who haven't seen a bad bear market because they're still fresh out of Wharton. And they talk about how low rates are bullish. They're wrong. They're dead fucking wrong. They're moronically wrong. According to Buffett, dropping rates are bullish. Low rates, you're done. It's game over.
Yeah.
You've squeezed every last drop of juice out of that orange. And now it's time for rates to go up. And if you look at the 30-year rates over the century, you can't help but conclude, holy shit, we reached the end of a credit cycle, which guys like James Grant, who's no slouch, say they're very long cycles, but when they turn, they lead to another very long cycle. And if rates are going from, the current level, they're going to drop again, then the Fed's going to raise them again, and they're going to do the same gig all over again. But if they go back up to 10 over some number of years, risk assets are going to suck.
Yeah. So is that what your base case would be, is that we now will, over the next few decades, be climbing higher with interest rates?
Yep. My base case is that if you look at the current valuations, I'm scratching my foot here. If you look at current valuations, you say, hey, look, we're gonna drop straight down to get back to fair value. I have about a 60% correction, round number, 60, 65, whatever. Well, okay. over 50. The boomers are not ready for that. You win big if that happens. Yes, you are. Yes, you will.
No, yeah, I agree.
Because you will get to buy assets cheap while you're young. Mm-hmm. So if out of your 40-year investment life, the markets suck during 20 of them and they do well during 20, you want them to do well during the second 20 after you've got some money in the bank. If you catch a great bull market, you don't want to have $2,000 in your retirement account. You want to have a wad.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And so everything tells me that 40 years from now, we're going to look up and the markets are not going to have moved. Inflation adjusted. Well, if they can only gain 4% a year, and you got to correct. So if the markets go straight down, it's a 60% correction. I have the fair value of the S&P under 2,000.
Man, what is it now?
And that's fair value. It's 46 or something. I don't know, 45. Yeah,
5,400.
Yeah, I don't even pay attention because if I know it's way overpriced, if I know we've pulled appreciation forward, it's appreciation we're not going to get. Why would I buy that market?
Mm-hmm.
at some point, it has to give me a better price in the future, or I can kick the shit out of that market by buying treasuries.
Yeah.
So there's just no way that you can win once you're overvalued. You've passed a fail-safe point, and now you got to pay the piper. And again, I think I must have told you this before, but there were other tailwinds. In 1981, China was coming out of the Dark Ages, and they sold us goods made by slave labor, right? 20 cents an hour sort of wages. They were willing to make anything for us. And for 40 years, we got dirt cheap shit. Those days are over. People said, "Oh, we're going to go to Africa." No, we're not. Africa's a shitty place. Africa's got terrible geography. It's got no inland waterways. It just sucks. Hernando de Soto. You want to verify that? Read Hernando de Soto's The Wealth of Capital or something. He talks about why Africa's never going to be worth a shit as a booming economy. It doesn't have the geography for it. And it doesn't have the legal system at all. India's already not where China started. So India's already sort of up the food chain. So we're not going to get dirt cheap out of India. We'll get cheaper. We started with PEs of the market, or valuations, if you want to use more general ones, of 6. Right? You were getting a 15% return just by buying the companies, just because you're paying $6 for each dollar of earnings. And the boomer demographic, we're just hitting stride. We brought our wives, everything. The demographics, which economists talk about, was phenomenal. Now we're a bunch of old fucks. We're behind Japan, but our replacement rate is 1.7 for families now. We're below ZPG. Which, by the way, we're not even the worst. The rest of the world's worse. Now, as an environmental type, you say, well, that's good, right? We're not going to tax the planet's resources. Okay, but we're going to have to swallow the fact that we got a bunch of useless eaters like me who are going to demand goods and services and not do anything ever again constructive.
It's true, huh?
And then on top of that, so the valuations compounded. The valuation, which shouldn't move, compounded over 40 years at over 3% a year. The next 40 years is going to compound at negative 3%. I don't exactly know the path, but it's got to get back to cheap. You say, well, why does it have to get back to cheap? I go, well, let's ask, can you name a market that got overvalued that didn't get back to cheap? There's no market in the history of markets that's ever stayed overvalued. They all get back to cheap. It's gravity. Gravity's undefeated.
Yeah. What's the something like a place that has had hyperinflation like Venezuela, like their stock market chart looks like that, right? It looks like NVIDIA, the whole stock market, but I guess that is also probably valued cheap, I would guess. Do you know how that works in like a hyperinflationary?
Well, how did
scenario?
Weimar Germany play out, right? We ended up with World War I, II. World War II.
Yeah.
And Argentina, the defaults on debts. Argentina defaulted 6 times, and during the absolute pinnacle of the credit cycle a couple of years ago, they were selling Argentinian century bonds that returned 6% from a country that had defaulted 6 times in 100 years.
Man, yeah.
Who would buy that crap? And the answer is the Kentucky pension fund reaching for yield.
Oh man, really? Wow.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
Right? I don't know positively. Reminds me of an assertion I made about us bombing Russian targets, not Ukrainians. Guy says, you have no evidence of that. And I go, you have no evidence that the Ukrainian knows how to run our weapons. Right? It's got to be. We have boots on the ground in Ukraine.
Yeah.
There's just things that if you tried to steel man the argument, it doesn't work. And one of the things is once you're overvalued, at some point you're going to be undervalued. always been true.
I actually wanted to ask you about this. You mentioned Argentina. Have you been following what Milei is doing? And what are your thoughts on that movement?
I don't have a strong opinion because it looks like a miracle, which
it does.
Makes me a little nervous, right?
Yeah.
Good to be true almost, right?
Yeah.
Someone just said that he's trying to get them into NATO. And I go, oh, that's a problem. Mm-hmm. Because the really logical him to want to do would be to get into the BRICS. And that's kind of the opposite of getting into NATO.
Yeah.
So there's something very funny going on. He's playing us like Zelensky or something. I don't know. I don't know what but on the surface it looks phenomenal, right? But it might be too good to be true.
Yeah.
Because I don't think you straighten out a country like that with no pain.
No. Yeah, I don't.
Where's the pain?
Agree. Yeah.
Where's the pain? And the answer is we haven't seen it yet, or we're not going to see it.
Well, I guess
it's some sort of ruse.
So he's like cutting the federal government size in half and balancing the budget, right?
So who's feeding those workers?
Yeah, that would be the pain we're not hearing about, maybe.
Right, and you can say, well, they're now doing constructive things. I go, in 3 months?
No, definitely not. Yeah, definitely not.
Right? Maybe they're YouTube influencers now, right?
Yeah. No, I was more thinking of it from the perspective, like, if we cut half of the federal workers from the United States, we wouldn't feel any pain. We wouldn't see anything different. And those people would.
No, yes. Yeah, well, we all would.
I don't think the services wouldn't be worse if you went through.
Oh, we wouldn't feel that kind of pain.
Yeah.
But the federal government right now is something like 50% of our GDP.
Yeah. It's crazy.
So if you all of a sudden throw out half of that, you're throwing out 25. You're in the Great Depression immediately if you throw those guys out of work. So it's a big welfare state, right?
Yeah.
And there's some people I'd love to see jobless. Let's start with Biden, working our way down to Kathy Hochul and Fauci. Unfortunately, I'd cut his pension and
Well, Biden would probably start a business or a supermarket or something after, so he'd be productive.
Yeah, you can find him in the vegetable section. Yeah.
Nice. That's right. Oh boy.
Did you see the Trump comeback to the judge? By the way, I got to tell this story. That Trump did what is a comeback that I thought was one of the most clever comebacks I've ever heard. So Trump's in the middle of this horrific trial, and at the end of a long day, he says, "What a moron" to the judge, which is amazing because who says that to a judge in a case that they're being tried for something, right? But Trump does. And the judge slaps him with a $1,000 contempt charge. And Trump says, I just said 3 words. And the judge says, that's contempt. And Trump starts flipping through his wallet. And the judge says to him, sort of trying to calm the thing down, he says, you don't have to pay me now. And Trump says, I'm just looking to see if I have enough money to say 2 more words.
No way. I did not hear that. That's amazing.
And I'm going, I can only dream of coming up with a comeback like that.
Seriously, that is impressive.
I mean, that's just so guys like Dave Smith, who's no Trump fan, they say he is a phenomenal comic. He's a phenomenal stand-up comic.
Yeah, he is. He's incredible.
Right.
Incredible. So is that so which criminal will you be backing then? Is the convicted one or the unconvicted one?
I'm voting for the felon. Yeah. I just don't think he's done anything to earn the loss of my vote. I don't think he's done anything.
No, and that's just such a microcosm of where we are. Like, like bad economic news is good for the stock market because it means money printing, and a president-elect getting convicted of crimes is good because no one believes it's really real. Well, everyththing's just upside down. The signals, it's crazy.
Do you think the Democrats misjudged it, or are we at the wrong layer of the onion on this one? Do you think the Democrats actually thought they were going to hurt Trump doing this shit? Do you think they believed? I
would guess so. Yeah. I mean, that's the simplest answer. What do you think?
Well, it's the simplest, but it seems so stupid, especially
because wrong every time
they did something like this, it hurt. You think they would have said, we got to quit making this guy a martyr. Every time we do.
It's true. Yeah.
We lose. And I also like to ask, do you think the judge, Merchant, wishes he were not the judge now?
You told me. I don't know. It's been too much heat.
I got to figure he thought, this is going to be great going after Trump. And now he realizes he's in the middle of something much bigger.
Yeah.
And I think he realizes that that he's going to have to make a decision for which there will be no good answer.
Yeah.
What would be the best answer? What would be, for the country? For the what's the most frictionless answer you could imagine him coming up with on July 11th? It's not obvious, right?
No.
Because if he says, I think I got there first, although I might not have. I said 4 years of community service.
Yeah, that's right.
But the judge has got to, if he's a legitimate judge, forget about whether he's illegitimate because he's let politics taint him. He's got to realize that history's not going to write a great chapter about him.
No.
No matter what happens in the trial, I think he has paid a very dear price.
Yeah, it's probably true.
And I'm always asked by guys, are we going to have a civil war? And I say, there's no Mason-Dixon line. There's no clean borders to fight over something. So in a sense, we're in the middle of a civil war because we're all fighting with each other over just bullshit.
Yeah.
But he is kind of in the middle of it. And I bet he wishes he were not. I bet he does. I bet he has sleepless nights.
Yeah.
And I don't think he played it well.
No.
Now, there's that Facebook post where someone said, my cousin's on the jury, Trump's going to get convicted. And then he said, thank all of you for your best efforts, that sort of thing, a Facebook post.
Okay. I didn't see that.
And the judge drew it to the attention of both parties. Now, we don't even know if one of the jurors does have a cousin who did post that. But the judge took it seriously enough to tell both parties. My theory is that the Democrats are like the collie. Collies tend to do this. That chase cars. When I was a kid, dogs chased cars because there were a ton of collies because Lassie was a popular show. They don't want to catch them. They just want to chase them.
Yeah.
And that the Democrats, to the extent, if they catch them, then they don't know what to do. And so I wouldn't be shocked if that Facebook post was a way to end the trial.
Oh, wow.
Remember when the Supreme Court was going to rule on Roe v. Wade in a week in advance? It leaked. And they talked about, we have to find the leaker. This is just terrible. And we never did we?
Yeah.
Well, if I were the Supreme Court, I go, this is going to cause some trouble. Let's leak it. Let's let people burn off steam while it's still a theoretical construct. And by the time we actually tell them, look, you're losing Roe v. Wade,
Mm-hmm.
They're already worn out. They've already protested, but they haven't killed anybody or anything because it's still not positive what's going to happen. So they burned out. So the Supreme Court basically released the pressure by leaking it.
Mm.
So this could be this Facebook post could be a way of ending the trial, much the way I thought Omicron was potentially released to end the pandemic.
Oh, wow.
Well, it was a non-lethal virus.
Yeah.
Even if it was fake, let's say there was no Omicron. But they say now the dominant one is Omicron and it's not lethal, so let's call it a day. We're done.
It's an interesting theory. The one thing I always struggle with is like how do so many of us think that all these people in power are so incompetent and that also they're capable of something super competent, super creative and competent would be releasing a Facebook post from a cousin as a way out of the trial if they need a back door. I mean, that's actually super competent. So how do you manage those two? Like these people are competent and evil or just incompetent because they're at odds.
So Tucker Carlson puts forth the theory that Nixon was taken out of power on purpose. And what he points out is that the Watergate burglars were CIA. Deep Throat was CIA. Mm-hmm. What I didn't know until recently is that out of left field came two journalists, one of which had no training in journalism, named Bob Woodward,
right,
who was former naval intelligence. So it really looks like, and as Tucker puts it, Nixon was unbelievably popular. He had the highest popularity rating of any president, supposedly. He was rocking and rolling, and they took him out. And so then the question is it possible that all the incompetence is just a facade?
Yeah.
That you guys you got E. Gordon Liddy and E. Howard Hunt, G. Gordon Liddy and E. Howard Hunt. Why they all have first letters, I don't know. and Ollie North. I was on a Zoom call with a military intel guy named Tony Schaffer. And he was really fascinating to chat with. And it went on for about 2.5 hours. There's a bunch of us, and he was the real deal. And again, a story, I tend to repeat myself in these podcasts, but fortunately it's such a big space that your viewers don't necessarily hear what I said to other viewers. I put out a post on Tony Schaffer on Twitter, and some journalist jumped on it and said, why don't you ask Tony about why he lied so much about Bergdahl? Bergdahl, he's the guy who walked off the base and joined the Taliban or something.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm thinking, what's that all about? And then Schaffer jumps in and starts throwing shitballs back at him, and they go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And so I do a DM to Schaffer, and I say, Tony, sorry to drag you into that. You guys obviously have a history. And Schaffer said, yeah, he wanted to goad me into spilling my guts on some shit that I know about. Bergdahl, is that the name? I might be getting the name wrong.
I think Bergdahl.
Something like that, though. Bergdahl or something. He said, what Ames doesn't know is that I was the lead negotiator to try to get him out.
Oh, really?
Going, oh, what a fucked up world, right? Man. What a small world. And so I think they're super competent people. Mm-hmm. And it's conceivable that they're able to make sure that the incompetent people who are the front, the AOCs, the idiots, the Joe Bidens, one of the great risks that Trump posed is that he's competent enough and rebellious enough that they couldn't control him. Or there's people who say, he's just another one of the well-orchestrated players in this big drama that we call life, and that the whole thing is orchestrated. And I have a little trouble with that theory, but it's not one that I can summarily dismiss either. They seem to work awfully hard to get Trump out of there.
Yeah.
And I know people, smart guys, who think there's no chance he's going to get to be president again, and if they have to, they'll cap him.
Oh, wow.
And of course, it'll be a right-wing extremist who did.
Yeah, yeah.
And they'll say that he was angry at Trump for not building the wall and he was unstable. And then there'll be a trial and we won't hear much about it. And then the guy will go away for life and we won't hear anything more about it.
Oh, man.
And the commission to investigate it will be head up by a former CIA head. Like, when they investigated Kennedy's assassination, the chairman of the Warren Commission was the guy who killed him. So that didn't work so well.
Yeah.
So I think our CIA is a global organized crime group that at times works for the United States, but they're really organized just like, the various Italian mob worked for the United States during World War II too. So there's that. And I think they're self-funded for the most part. They have a line item in the budget, but I think most of their money is Black Ops money. And I think it's a sleeper cell model too. So I actually asked Tony that question in a recorded Zoom call. I wouldn't say this shit if it wasn't in a recorded Zoom call.
Yeah.
And he said wasn't very well distributed though, so it's a well kept secret. I said I made reference to it being a sleeper cell model. I said, oh, absolutely. So it's like when we blew up the pipeline, right? We blew up the pipeline, right?
Yeah.
It might not have been our hands on some switch, but that pipeline would not be in pieces on the ocean floor if the United States didn't sign off and blown up that pipeline. And I could imagine the head of the CIA going, did we do that? Someone tell me if that was us or not. Right? And there's just these groups. The book Operation Gladio is a fascinating book. It's about the world drug cartel, the world drug trade. And it presents the case that basically the world drug trade is really sort of monolithic, with the exception of fentanyl, which is China. And it's a triumvirate between the Vatican, which are the bankers, organized crime, which get the drugs to the street, and the CIA, which deals with the geopolitical problems.
Oh man.
And that the whole and are you gonna try to encroach on that triumvirate's territory?
No.
And the Vatican, I really do think there's the Vatican, the religious guys, and the Vatican, the organization. Vatican, the political / economic organization.
Yeah.
Which could have resources that are not imaginable. Because where do you live? I can't remember. You live in Boston.
Well, I'm from Boston. I'm in San Diego. Live in San Diego.
So how much real estate does the Catholic Church own in San Diego?
Oh, I don't know, but a lot.
Unimaginable value real estate, right?
Oh, yeah.
Unimaginable. Right in the center of the city and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
People have been donating their life savings to the Catholic Church for 2,000 years.
Yeah.
When you die and you have no heirs, you give it to the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
For 2,000 years.
Yeah.
They have been compounding their wealth for 2,000 years. I was talking to a guy who was the guy who figured out
crazy.
That remdesivir was killing most of the patients in the hospital, and from COVID. And he says, you know who I think China's really battling? I said, no, yeah, I do want to know. And he said, the Catholic Church. And I've been thinking about it ever since he said it, and I realized, the Catholic Church may have more power than the United States government at some level.
Really? Wow.
Well, let's say they own 30% of the globe.
Is that how high? No, that's...
I don't know. I just threw out a number.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I bet they own a lot of Italy.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
They own a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And so the world's this big onion, and we're sitting you and I are talking about level 24 of the onion. And the truth might be sitting at level 36 of the onion.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
pretty wild.
We're just kind of getting hints of it. A guy named Peter Dale Scott was, I believe, the guy who invented the phrase deep state.
Okay.
And he wrote a number of books, and he was a Berkeley English professor, and he started chasing down the drug cartels, trying to understand them. And he immediately discovered that they were not what he thought, and that he immediately realized that it was intelligence groups. And I used to think the drug cartels owned our politicians. They'd say, look, we're going to donate to your campaign.
Yeah.
Alternatively, we're going to bury your family alive in the Meadowlands. So, you make the choice, right? And so they choose to accept the donation, right? That I don't believe is how it works. I believe that we say to the drug cartels, we'll let you run the drugs, but you're going to share the money with us. And when we need you, you're going to let us put an air base on your land.
Wow.
And you're going to let us do what we need. So I think, and when someone goes rogue like Noriega, we go get him. When someone goes rogue like Gaddafi, we go get him. And so, but the waning power of the United States might mean that in your lifetime, possibly, unfortunately, in my lifetime even, might be noticeably gone. There are guys who claim that militarily we're not as strong as we think we are, and that we're ready for the last war, not the next war.
Mm.
And I don't quite know what that means, right? I don't, but air superiority might not be it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And how many immigrants are coming over the border this year? The estimate's 4 million, projecting forward.
That's crazy.
4 million, something like 3 million last year. You say, wow, you don't know who they are. And I go, yeah, you do. First of all, there's guys like Kennedy who went down there and said he estimated there was 2% Hispanic. 2%.
Yeah, that's wild.
Now, maybe he's wrong. Maybe it's 10% Hispanic. The second thing is, if 2 to 4 million immigrants are coming across the border, unimpeded, forget unimpeded, aided and abetted, given cash cards worth thousands, given plane tickets to go to any city they want. What are the odds that enemies of the United States, which you must assume we have some, are somehow so stupid that they're going to not realize they should send their guys in?
Yeah.
Answer zero. Right? There's no chance that Iran, that China, that Russia, that you name it, hasn't shoved operatives across that border. So if we have a situation where all of a sudden things start blowing up unexpectedly, food plants, right? How many food plants blew up?
I know.
A lot of them. Derailed trains in East Palestine, maybe.
Yeah.
But if the border's wide open and you're the bad guys, are you going to tell your guys to raise hell? Or are you going to say, sit tight? Because the border's still open.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right.
So we close the borders and go, okay, that's it. That's all we can get in the border. Now it's time to unleash the Kraken.
I know, seriously.
This is such a logical scenario.
Yeah, it is, unfortunately.
And so all of a sudden we could find that our transformers are being blown up. I've seen podcasts by guys who say, look, there are 9 sites, as few as 9 sites that you'd have to take out to take our grid down all the way.
Really?
Yeah. And that our grid is just not hard. Who did I watch? Someone was talking about it where our grid is so impregnable that there's so many ways it could be brought down, and we would be cannibalizing each other within a month. We'd be out of food within a month. And I remember I followed Y2K carefully. It wasn't about that I knew that it would or wouldn't happen. It's that I felt that I knew what would happen if it was true. So the risk was profound to me. The probability was unknowable. So I went through all the intellectual gymnastics of what ifs. And one of the great concerns is that when, for example, the cops have to choose between helping control problems or going home and taking care of their own family, what are they going to choose? And the answer is they're going to go home and take care of their family.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then you've lost, right? Now so you wanted the cops to be fully prepared. You wanted their families to be stocked up and ready to go and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And but it wouldn't take long at all for the thin veneer of civilization, which is already starting to show wear and tear, to sort of peel right off.
Let me ask you one more question, then we'll wrap it up. How do you? This stuff must drive you crazy. I don't read about a lot of this stuff because I've got 2 little kids. I've got to work.
Yeah,
I've got Bitcoin. How do you manage it psychologically that you're taking in all this stuff?
Well, it's getting harder because I went from thinking the world was largely normal, looking for the stupidity, right? Looking for the human folly amongst normal, to a world that looks totally abnormal now.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's because I've now sort of taken the wrong pill. I think it looks pretty abnormal to everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And the only thing that makes it not look abnormal is you just refuse to read it.
Yeah, that's true.
And it's a challenge because the bar I set, or that gets set by me without my control, of what shocks me has gone way up. So I can read an article, like I read an article this morning about it, how we're grotesquely undercutting the kids who were killed by the vaccine.
Oh, man. Yeah.
Right. And I go, okay. So as I said, I copy a sentence or two from the article and copy the link in case I decide I want to do an update on the vaccine. But to me, the vaccine's an old story. Now, people are still dying.
Yeah,
from the vaccine.
It's just not shocking, but it's not.
It's just not shocking anymore, right? It's there's actually a name for it where you get used to not being able to deal with something. In Russia, I can't remember. I wrote it down, so I'll run into the name for it again when I go to write. But you just reach a point where you say, look, nothing's going to change. You just come to terms with that. And that's when pretty much you've lost, right? When you reach that point. But, someone the other day on a podcast said to me, he said, well, something about the military taking control. And I said, it never, ever works well when the military takes control.
No.
Especially because I don't think our military is necessarily staffed by good guys anymore, right? They've dealt with the Michael Flynns, who might be a whack job. I mean, Michael Flynn says shit that would shock people. And was he, I think, a 3-star general? So you either say he's a 3-star general who's lost his mind, or he's a 3-star general who's out of the closet completely on shocking issues.
Mm-hmm.
But he says shit. He accuses politicians of being pedophiles and stuff like that all the time. No.
Yeah. Wow.
And so either he has dropped his guard and said, I'm not sitting quiet anymore, or he's gone nuts. The guy who, I don't know where your views on 9/11 are, but I don't think it's even theoretically possible that the narrative we've been told is the correct narrative at this point. There's too many laws of physics that have to be ignored for 9/11 to be what it is. And there was some general whose career was spent looking at aerial photos, and he goes out there and did a bunch of these podcasts with people saying, look, if you look at the hole in the Pentagon, it doesn't match the plane at all. He was just, and if you go to Wikipedia, I can't remember his name. It says, oh, yeah, he's a generally lost his mind. He's a complete nutcase.
Yeah.
By the way, don't go to Wikipedia for anything of value, anything politically tricky.
No.
Larry Sanger, who I chat with occasionally, who founded Wikipedia, says it's completely FBI, CIA controlled at this point. And if remember the Lahaina fires, remember the estimated number of dead kids? It's like USA was saying 970 kids are missing. When you have a raging inferno like that, 970 kids are missing. Those are 970 kids who you're probably not going to find.
Yeah.
You go to Wikipedia now, and the total death toll is 90, and there's no mention of kids.
Oh, man. Yeah.
In real time, the body count estimates were humongous. And they were logical. But Wikipedia now has it at nothing, and there's no mention of dead kids. Not a whiff. I searched the word child, children, kid, no mention of anything. And 90 dead people. You know, the whole city got fried by this raging inferno.
Yeah.
So, my brother, I'm going to read a book called American Betrayal, I think it is, by a woman named Diana West. My brother says it's a compelling book about all the things we did in and around World War II that really were betraying to the U.S. and that we accepted it. Guys like FDR and stuff, sending them nuclear secrets and shit like that. And these really horrific things we did, and how we sort of handed Eastern Europe over to the Russians. And I haven't read the book, so I'm just getting it secondhand from phone calls. But it's going to be one of my books going forward. It's possible it's been this screwed up the whole way.
Yeah.
And then you start asking, do we really know anything about history at all? So Victor Davis Hanson says about, the taking of the Aztecs. Well, why did they lose? Well, the story we get is, A, they thought the Spaniards were gods, and B, disease took them all out. And Hanson says the disease is overstated, and they thought we were gods for about 2 days. And then they realized that the Spaniards were not gods, and that they simply fucked up the fight. They just screwed it up. And that's not the story we got told in elementary school.
No.
Because you don't want to say that indigenous people lost a 1 million to 500 battle.
Yeah.
That's an embarrassing defeat. That's like Skype losing to Zoom.
Yeah. Man.
Or Nokia.
Yeah. That's right.
Dogs are coming. Now I got 2.
Well.
So I don't know how I handle it. It's getting harder, actually.
It seems like that. I don't know. I'm going to kind of bury my head in the sand for a couple more years, maybe.
You should. I mean, it's really, you got to somehow live your life.
Well, were you into all this stuff when you had little kids? That's one question.
No.
Okay. You got the free time now?
My first wake up call, I'll tell you a quick history and then a huge gap. My first wake up call was when I was 18 years old, and I got dragged to a lecture by a guy named Mark Lane, who talked about Kennedy's assassination. I don't remember much. Mark Lane was one of these big swinging dick lawyers, and he defended Oswald for 2 days, right? The only thing I remember vividly is him saying that he was hired by the Kennedys. And I go, oh, that's not what I expected.
Oh, wow.
Then I went for years without paying attention, and I think 9/11 kind of was a big wake-up call, though. When I started looking at market structure in the mid-'90s, and I realized that Wall Street really was corrupt to the core.
Yeah.
That started doing, and then 9/11 came, and I didn't know anything about 9/11. I occasionally picked up little shards, but not believable. And then one day a physicist sent me Building 7 collapsing, and I can't watch Building 7 collapse and then say everything was normal. It just doesn't the laws of physics tell me there's no chance building 7. Then you back it out and you say building 1 and 2 really couldn't have collapsed the way they did either, in my opinion. And then it just gets weirder and weirder and weirder, the whole story. And so then once you go down the 9/11 rabbit hole, then it's very hard to come back out.
Yeah. I bet.
And then you realize that Pearl Harbor was teed up for the attack, and you realize that that Vietnam was teed up for the attack, and you realize that you realize that Gulf War, that we even teed up Hussein to attack Kuwait. And then we didn't even bother to tee him up on the next one. We just declared that he was a bad guy and attacked him.
Yeah.
And you got the Reichstag fire by the Germans, and you got Lusitania, World War I. The Archduke didn't start World War I. When the Archduke got shot, everyone thought he was a dick. No one cared. They said, what a fuckhead he was. And the Germans had to beg the Austrians into retaliating because they wanted to go to war because they thought they'd be weaker in a couple of years. They didn't think they could win it in a couple of years. So they needed the Austrians to go after them. Good book called Europe's Last Summer was recommended to me by a guy at the CFR named Ben Steele. And it's a really different start to World War I than I thought. And stuff like that. And so then you discover that, we're no better than the Romans. We're no better than the ancient Greeks in terms of, picking on some neighbor and beating the piss out of them and raping and pillaging.
Yeah.
There's no reason to believe we've changed.
Yeah. Well,
history is
there we go.
Written by the
there
victors.
We have it.
History is written by the victors.
It's true.
And so our history is not necessarily what happened.
That is true.
It would be different if the Germans won, right? World War II. The Germans won World War II, but history would be different.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Right.
Yep. Well, Dave, listen, appreciate you taking time out from the cabin. This is great.
Yeah. I'll see you later.
I appreciate it. I hope you have a great summer.
Send me an email when you post it.
I sure will.
Okay.
All right. Talk soon.
Adios.